How well does AMD's FSR4 upscaler perform compared to NVIDIA's new DLSS 4.5? Are AMD still relatively close to NVIDIA in image quality? Has FSR4 fallen further behind? Or does FSR4 perhaps have some strengths in certain situations? That's what I'll be exploring in today's video across a wide range of examples at 4K and 1440p. I've already looked at how DLSS 4.5 improves upon DLSS 4 in a previous video, specifically focusing on the new preset M compared to the old preset K. The second generation transformer model is generally an improvement, especially relating to disocclusion artifacts, ghosting, and foliage quality. But there are some trade-offs. Several artifacts have gotten worse with DLSS 4.5, and there's a performance hit when using the new model, especially on older GPUs. Meanwhile, AMD's upscaler has not been updated substantially since the launch of FSR4 in March 2025. AMD bizarrely renamed FSR4 to FSR Upscaling in their Redstone release late last year, but since this could refer to any of the various FSR versions, I'm going to keep calling it FSR4 in this video for clarity because I'm testing the latest ML-powered version. The Redstone release did add new features like ML-powered frame generation and ray regeneration, but the FSR4 model did not receive any upgrades. So today is a relatively simple comparison. NVIDIA's latest upscaling model that has been recently updated compared to AMD's latest upscaling model, which is the same as last year. Let's start with image quality after this. Today's video is sponsored by Gigabyte's GeForce RTX 50 series gaming laptops. The Aorus Master 18 and 16 are super high performance beasts with up to RTX 5090 laptop graphics, stunning 240Hz HDR displays, and top-end features like a PCIe Gen 5 SSD and Wi-Fi 7. The Aero X16 Copilot Plus PC is the perfect choice for gamers and creators on the go with a portable chassis, up to RTX 5070 laptop graphics, and a high-resolution Pantone validated display. The gaming A16 and A16 Pro are also available with up to RTX 5080 laptop graphics, wind force cooling, and overall great bang for buck. With NVIDIA GeForce RTX graphics, you have access to superb performance and cutting-edge features like DLSS 4 transformer model upscaling and 4x multi-frame generation. To learn more about Gigabyte's RTX 50 series gaming laptops, check the links in the description. Let's start once again with texture quality. FSR4, like DLSS 4 and DLSS 4.5, does not have any issues with TAA blur. The clarity of the game is similar, both stationary and in motion, when using any of these technologies. However, I noticed with DLSS 4.5 that the overall presentation is sharper than DLSS 4, which some of the time, but not always, makes the game look better. When throwing FSR4 into the mix, all using the 4K performance mode here, DLSS 4.5 is comparatively even sharper. This is because generally FSR4 isn't as sharp as DLSS 4, producing a softer presentation, so clearly this would mean it's not as sharp as DLSS 4.5 either. Of course, in my opinion, the FSR4 image is usable, though in a lot of games it's noticeable during real-time gameplay how much sharper DLSS 4.5 is on a 4K monitor. As the level of sharpness is very similar across all the different modes, you can't simply run FSR4 using the quality mode and expect it to produce sharper and cleaner textures than DLSS 4.5 using the performance mode. This is just the inherent look to each upscaler. FSR4's softer presentation does have some benefits. In some titles, it's the upscaler that is least likely to produce grain and pixelation, instead replacing that with a smoother reconstruction of details. You can see that quite clearly in this Horizon Zero Dawn example when we pause and examine some of the grass details. There's noticeable pixelation in the DLSS 4.5 performance mode image, while FSR4 is smoother using the same mode, despite not being as sharp overall. There's also the issue of DLSS 4.5 producing more artifacts on textures in some situations. I noticed previously that in this Cyberpunk 2077 example, DLSS 4.5 produced moire patterns on the ground where DLSS 4 didn't. FSR4 is also not especially prone to moire patterns, so in this example DLSS 4.5 actually looks worse in motion than FSR4 despite having that sharper look. I think fewer motion artifacts is better than sharper textures in this instance. However, FSR4 is still not as good as DLSS 4 preset K, so in this instance an NVIDIA GPU owner could simply revert to using DLSS 4 if they found the artifacts distracting in preset M. In this example, in Mafia the Old Country though, I found that both FSR4 and DLSS 4.5 struggled to keep the wood texture stable, whereas DLSS 4 preset K was obviously the best, all using the performance mode. It seems that FSR4 can be more resilient to these sorts of artifacts than DLSS 4.5, but not always. Fine detail stability has always been the weakest aspect to FSR4. It's the upscaler that is most prone to shimmering and sizzling artifacts, and occasionally has weird issues where the quality mode is less stable than balanced. But DLSS 4.5 is a stability side grade versus DLSS 4, so relative to FSR4, it's quite an interesting battle. Sometimes DLSS 4.5 is even more stable than it was previously, pushing further ahead of FSR4 in this area. But sometimes there's a stability regression that can make things look on par or occasionally worse than FSR4. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is a pretty straightforward case where DLSS 4 and 4.5 are more stable than FSR4. The two DLSS presets trade blows depending on where we look and the resolution being used. But across 4K performance mode and 1440p balanced mode, it's clear that DLSS provides superior stability. When looking at Mafia the Old Country, things are less clear. None of these upscalers perform particularly well using the 4K performance mode, but FSR4 isn't that different to the others. It's got the flicker problems of DLSS 4.5 in motion and the fine line aliasing of DLSS 4, so overall FSR4 is slightly worse than either DLSS technique, but it's not like DLSS is performing magic here that makes it look far better than FSR. In the Lighthouse test in the same scene, I think DLSS 4.5 does have better stability around the fence area, but again for wire and rope details, all three upscalers have issues. Running the same scene again but using 1440p balanced, and this is where in my opinion FSR4 actually looks more stable than DLSS 4.5. The flicker issues are more obvious in the preset M image than FSR4, and while FSR4 still isn't quite as good as DLSS 4 preset K, it's very usable. Here's Cyberpunk 2077 using 4K performance mode upscaling, and there's three elements I want you to focus on. The curved metal stairs around the cylindrical vat, the low power lines in front of the building, and the railing on top of the more distant vats. This is where each technique can trade blows within the same frame. DLSS 4.5 is the best at upscaling the stairs, with FSR4 being the worst and most garbled. The power lines are the most stable and clearest in FSR4, even here in the performance mode, and then the railing is probably best again in DLSS 4.5, with FSR4 and preset K DLSS 4 trading blows. Running the same scene through using the 1440p balanced mode, and again we see the same strengths and weaknesses of each technology. Overall, I'd probably say that DLSS 4.5 has the fewest issues throughout this run, while FSR4 has the most elements with stability problems, but it's not always accurate, especially since the DLSS 4.5 upgrade, to say that every game will look less stable in all elements using FSR4. What this also means is that sometimes FSR4 quality mode is a better match for DLSS 4 or 4.5 performance mode, meaning DLSS does a better job of handling stability at a lower render resolution. This can be the case in games like Ratchet & Clank, where you need to crank up the FSR4 quality mode to get a similar output image in this regard. But then in other examples like Mafia with the boat, switching FSR4 up to the quality mode makes it look better than DLSS using the performance mode, because the render resolution is much more important for this type of fine detail. As I said though, generally DLSS is more stable either with preset K or preset M depending on the game in question. Usually there's a 1 to 2 tier stability advantage to DLSS, so to achieve FSR4 quality mode like stability, you can use DLSS 4/4.5 balanced or performance. But I think it's important to emphasize that this is a case-by-case basis and certainly doesn't apply in every scenario. It's not as simple as lining up FSR4 quality versus DLSS 4.5 performance and calling them equal. One of the strengths we found with FSR4 previously was how the technology handled disocclusion. In most scenarios, FSR4 produced fewer disocclusion artifacts than DLSS 4, and this was most noticeable at lower rendering resolutions like 4K performance mode. With less sizzling around third-person characters in motion, this made FSR4 generally the better choice for third-person games, though it also produced fewer artifacts around weapons in first-person games too. DLSS 4.5 significantly improves disocclusion to the point where, when viewing examples like this in The Last of Us Part 1, DLSS 4.5 and FSR4 now trade blows. The level of sizzling is greatly reduced in DLSS 4.5, whereas DLSS 4 is clearly the worst of these three examples. Whether or not you find DLSS 4.5 or FSR4 better depends on the sorts of things you prefer. DLSS 4.5 tends to reveal sharper and more detailed backgrounds when disocclusion occurs, whereas FSR4 is softer and at times blurrier. However, the softer look of FSR4 can achieve better masking of disocclusion sizzle, that brief period of lower resolution rendering when the disocclusion occurs. Here's another example in Mafia of the Old Country, where I would say FSR4 and DLSS 4.5 are broadly similar when viewing 4K performance mode in the way they handle this artifact. In any titles where disocclusion occurs regularly like this, you'll want to use DLSS 4.5 on an NVIDIA GPU, or of course FSR4 on AMD. Along with disocclusion, DLSS 4.5 significantly reduces the prevalence of ghosting. I went through many examples to look for ghosting in either the DLSS 4 preset K image or FSR4, and found that in instances where either of these technologies had ghosting, DLSS 4.5 preset M was much less likely to ghost. For example, here with Cyberpunk 2077 and the streetlights, where generally FSR4 had the worst ghosting across a variety of modes and resolutions, this is cleaned up a lot in DLSS 4.5. In this scene, DLSS 4 is prone to ghosting along the carpet as Ratchet moves. This is fully eliminated in DLSS 4.5 and FSR 4. In Horizon Zero Dawn, particles were quite streaky across this wooden bridge using DLSS preset K. This is again minimized in DLSS 4.5 and to a large extent in FSR 4 as well, despite all using the performance mode at 4K. FSR 4 on the whole is less stable in this area and not as sharp, but in terms of ghosting specifically, it was less prone to artifacts here. Then we get to examples like Mafia of the Old Country. As Enzo turns around, DLSS 4 was prone to leaving behind a ghost trail in this scene, which is significantly reduced in FSR 4 and completely eliminated with DLSS 4.5. If you look really closely, FSR 4 has very faint trails, so DLSS 4.5 is ever so slightly superior in this example. Of course, as we showed in the previous video, DLSS 4.5 is not able to fully eliminate ghosting as seen in this Mafia example. However, in situations where DLSS 4.5 is producing ghosting, the same artifact is seen typically in FSR 4 but to a worse extent. Across all the examples I looked at, typically DLSS 4.5 is the best at handling and eliminating ghosting. FSR 4 trades blows with DLSS 4.5 in hair quality depending on the game and implementation. With better disocclusion handling in DLSS 4.5, typically hair looks cleaner and less sizzled than DLSS 4. However, hair in FSR 4 is generally pretty smooth, and while it may lack the detail of DLSS 4.5 in some situations, it can also be more stable and less grainy or sizzled. Take this example from The Last of Us. FSR 4 doesn't reconstruct as much detail, but this actually leads to less aliasing in the hair in the 4K performance mode. And while aliasing is reduced going from DLSS 4 to DLSS 4.5, it's not necessarily better than how FSR 4 handles it. I saw similar in Mafia, where FSR 4 and DLSS 4.5 both clearly look better than DLSS 4, but to me, the softer presentation of FSR 4 is more natural and less artifacty. There are some exceptions to this. At 1440p using the balanced mode, I tended to find FSR 4 hair a bit lacking in detail, and the overall softness shown here starts to become a weakness in hair quality relative to DLSS 4.5. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I also tended to find Aloy's hair to look better in DLSS 4.5 overall. This type of hair and animation simply worked better with the way DLSS 4.5 handles fine detail, and it doesn't suffer from as much aliasing here as in the other examples. Particle quality is an interesting one because different elements of particles are rendered better with each of the upscalers. For example, DLSS 4.5 has the least amount of particle ghosting, as seen in this Ratchet and Clank scene, and typically produces the sharpest particles as well. Occasionally, this can cause aliasing along the edges of particles, as I would say the softer look of FSR 4 leads to less aliasing than DLSS 4.5 at the expense of clarity and ghosting. DLSS 4 in this scene is a balance between the two. In this Mafia example, using the 4K performance mode, FSR 4 is more prone to particle flicker with these bright elements compared to DLSS 4.5, which produces the most stable particles, followed by DLSS 4. However, what's interesting is that when lowering the render resolution to 1440p balanced, now DLSS 4 preset K really struggles and fails to reconstruct particles to the right size, with lots of dimmed elements and flicker. FSR 4 does a much better job of reconstructing the particles properly, but continues to do so with some flicker. DLSS 4.5 strikes the best balance between proper particle quality and limited amounts of flicker. But then in this scene with snow in Horizon Zero Dawn, DLSS 4.5 preset M really struggles with grain and pixelation in the background behind the snow. FSR 4 tends to do the best job of handling this, and while the snow itself is probably higher quality in DLSS 4.5, I think the overall image that FSR 4 produces is more pleasing with fewer artifacts. So it's hard to say overall which upscaler is able to handle particles the best, as each case has strengths and weaknesses in different types of scenes. With previous comparisons of DLSS 4 and FSR 4, I found that transparency quality is quite similar between these upscalers. I'd also say the same of DLSS 4.5, given that transparencies have not been significantly improved with this latest version. Occasionally, I saw some examples where DLSS 4.5 is slightly better at rendering these elements, but for the most part, all three upscalers handle transparent items well, and we see similar sorts of artifacts across all three at lower render resolutions. Foliage quality is one of the areas that improved the most with DLSS 4.5, and this typically puts it ahead of FSR 4. Not always ahead, but in a lot of games the quality of DLSS 4.5 is noticeably superior. Here in Star Wars Outlaws, for example, when we focus on the trees swaying in the wind, the FSR 4 image is reasonably stable, but does so through a bit of blurring and smearing, particularly around the lower branches that overlap one another. DLSS 4.5 using the 4K performance mode avoids that smearing issue and also provides better fine detail reconstruction for the fine leafless branches at the tip of the trees. When looking at Mafia the Old Country, the results are really interesting. FSR 4 is more stable than DLSS 4 preset K. It removes the flickering seen around the branch details inside trees. But upon close inspection, FSR 4 is achieving this while smearing a lot of the fine details. So yes, the image is more stable in motion, but it's lacking in clarity. DLSS 4.5 on the other hand gives us both excellent stability and decent detail within the tree branches, making it clearly superior to FSR 4 in both the 4K performance and 1440p balance modes that we've been focusing on throughout this video. In some titles like The Last of Us, I saw very little difference in tree quality between DLSS 4 and DLSS 4.5, but in both instances the presentation was sharper and of a higher clarity than FSR 4. That's not to say FSR 4 looks bad in this example, it's just that the latest versions of DLSS take foliage quality to the next level. Grass is a different story though, and whether FSR 4 or DLSS 4.5 looks better can depend on the game itself. Here's Mafia again, this time focusing on grass. DLSS 4 preset K is quite problematic in this title using the performance mode, with grass appearing pixelated and grainy in motion. FSR 4 is much more stable, but this is because again, a lot of the details are being smoothed out and blurred using the performance mode. It looks better than DLSS 4, but it's kinda cheating to achieve that. When we then compare this to DLSS 4.5, I wouldn't say DLSS 4.5 is delivering amazing image quality on the level of native rendering, but the grass is much more stable than DLSS 4, while retaining details that are smeared in FSR 4. But then if you look at a title like Horizon Zero Dawn, yes, DLSS 4.5 appears sharper and more detailed than FSR 4, but this can lead to a lot of grain and an oversharp look in some situations. FSR 4 is smoother, it lacks detail, so it doesn't have a high resolution appearance in motion. However, if you look at the individual frames it's rendering, sometimes there is noticeably less pixelation than DLSS 4.5. Towards the end of this run, I actually think DLSS 4 preset K looks the best, which you absolutely couldn't say in Mafia, hence why this could be a case-by-case basis. Fence quality is undoubtedly superior in DLSS 4.5 compared to FSR 4. In this example in Cyberpunk 2077, we're looking at the 4K performance mode for all techniques, and with significant improvements to disocclusion in DLSS 4.5, it tends to look better than DLSS 4, despite some artifact issues in all the examples here. But FSR 4, on the other hand, is quite blurry and fails to properly reconstruct the fine details in the fence. In the Spider-Man 2 fence test, this is also true viewing overlapping fence details. FSR 4 isn't too bad compared to DLSS 4 preset K, but preset M is a lot clearer when viewing the performance mode, with better detail especially for the foreground fence. To achieve this level of clarity with FSR 4, you need to use the quality mode, which trades blows with DLSS 4.5 performance mode at 4K depending on where you look. Lastly, a look at lighting quality. This is an area we found DLSS 4.5 improved upon DLSS 4 due to changes in the way NVIDIA handles tone mapping, now performing upscaling in linear space before tone mapping occurs rather than in logarithmic space after tone mapping. This led to better lighting reconstruction in DLSS 4.5, typically presenting as brighter and more accurate highlights. What's interesting is that FSR4 appears to already be operating in the same way that DLSS 4.5 now does. So in scenes where we saw improved lighting with DLSS 4.5, FSR4 looks largely similar. This bright neon sign in Cyberpunk 2077 is noticeably more vibrant and bright in both the FSR4 and DLSS 4.5 images compared to DLSS 4, and the same can be said for several other examples of areas like bright particles and highlights on textures. It also means we see similar flickering artifacts around some of these bright elements in both FSR4 and DLSS 4.5, which is interesting. These artifacts are not present in DLSS 4 preset K. I guess this is something we just didn't really notice when comparing DLSS 4 to FSR4 previously, as it only makes a noticeable difference in specific scenes with lots of highlight brightness. Perhaps NVIDIA realized that FSR4 works this way and decided to implement a similar system with DLSS 4.5. Of course, a look at upscalers wouldn't be complete without a discussion on performance. However, I've left this to the end here because performance is not especially interesting, especially if you've previously seen our looks at DLSS 4 versus FSR4 and DLSS 4 versus DLSS 4.5. Essentially, FSR4 performs very similarly to DLSS 4 preset K on equivalent modern hardware, so the performance hit comparing DLSS 4.5 to FSR4 is similar to DLSS 4.5 versus DLSS 4. For example, in Cyberpunk 2077, I've tested using the Ultra Ray Tracing preset on the RTX 5070 Ti and RX 9070 XT. Using the 4K performance mode, DLSS 4 was 157% faster than native TAA, DLSS 4.5 was 128% faster, and FSR4 179% faster. At 1440p, FSR4 ended up delivering a very similar performance uplift to DLSS 4. Then in Mafia the Old Country, for example, I had DLSS 4 quality offering 63% more performance than native, DLSS 4.5 offered 50% more, and FSR4 offered 67% more at 4K. At 1440p, FSR4 ran slightly better on the 9070 XT than DLSS 4 on the 5070 Ti. And again, not much different to talk about looking at the Horizon Zero Dawn remastered results. With performance similar to DLSS 4, what we end up with is a situation where DLSS 4.5 is usually half a tier to a full tier slower than FSR 4. This means you'll see DLSS 4.5 performance delivering similar results to FSR 4 balanced in the worst cases, but most of the time it is a bit faster than FSR 4 balanced on equivalent Radeon hardware. In general, this makes similar modes like performance versus performance the appropriate matchup, hence why a lot of this video focused on same mode testing. I largely chose to focus on performance at 4K and balanced at 1440p because these configurations work really well with the latest upscalers. So there you have it. That's how DLSS 4.5 compares to FSR 4 at both 4K and 1440p resolutions. In my previous video looking at DLSS 4.5 versus DLSS 4, I said that while DLSS 4.5 does have some image quality regressions, in general it looks better and is the configuration I'd prefer to use, especially in the performance mode. Given that DLSS 4 was already delivering better image quality than FSR 4, it's no surprise that DLSS 4.5 is also better than FSR 4, and the gap has widened somewhat with this latest release. When dialing down to specific areas and artifacts, DLSS 4.5 is able to pull further ahead of FSR 4 in some situations. Overall sharpness and level of detail is typically even better now with DLSS 4.5, especially in areas like foliage and fences, and the stability and clarity of pixel level detail when using a low render resolution, such as the performance mode, is also improved. In some games, FSR 4's output is on the softer side, which can be of benefit when DLSS 4.5's output is over sharp, but most of the time I'd say DLSS 4.5 preset M has the appearance of the game running at a higher resolution, especially in motion. In other cases, DLSS 4.5 improves weaknesses and now delivers an experience similar to or better than FSR 4. One area is disocclusion, a real weakness to DLSS 4 preset K and a relative strength to FSR 4. Now with DLSS 4.5, disocclusion is on a similar level to FSR 4 while generally delivering higher detail. This benefits elements like hair and overlapping details, which are much improved with DLSS 4.5. NVIDIA have also put in work to minimize ghosting, so DLSS 4.5 is less likely to show that artifact compared to FSR 4. Some areas to DLSS 4.5 are a side grade relative to DLSS 4, such as overall stability, but in this instance, DLSS was already starting from a higher baseline than FSR 4. Stability is probably the biggest weakness to FSR 4 in general, especially when using lower render resolutions, and while in some cases DLSS 4.5 is a regression compared to DLSS 4, it typically still stays ahead of FSR 4. There are situations where DLSS 4.5 is less stable than FSR 4, but GeForce owners can typically stay ahead of FSR 4 by reverting back to DLSS 4 preset K in those instances. I didn't really see any examples where FSR 4 beat both preset M and preset K. What's interesting though is that while DLSS 4.5 is generally superior to FSR 4, there are some instances where FSR 4 looks better. I already mentioned one example, which is in titles that appear oversharp using DLSS 4.5. FSR 4 is softer, and that might be preferable in certain games. However, again, GeForce owners frustrated with the oversharp look could just revert back to preset K. The other advantage FSR 4 has is that in some cases DLSS 4.5 can look a bit pixelated and grainy, like with heavy use of particles or some grass implementations. FSR 4's smoother and at times less detailed presentation actually helps in those scenarios because AMD's algorithm tends to avoid this pixelation and grain artifacts as a result. As I've said a lot throughout this video, if I had to pick one or the other, I typically think DLSS 4.5 produces noticeably better image quality, especially when using viable configurations like 4K performance and 1440p balanced. Nvidia is still in the lead when it comes to image quality, and when factoring in the higher performance cost of DLSS 4.5, they've been able to nudge their upscaler a little further ahead of FSR 4 than the position they were in previously. But I wouldn't go so far as to say DLSS 4.5 is capable of magic levels of upscaling that's multiple quality tiers better than FSR 4. Can DLSS 4.5 performance mode look better than FSR 4 quality mode? Yes, in some games, in some scenes, when assessing specific artifacts or elements. Foliage would be one example of that, but it's not true in a general sense. It's pretty easy to find situations where, for example, FSR 4 quality is much less grainy than DLSS 4.5 performance, or better at handling fine details in motion. Sometimes the actual render resolution still matters, and the higher you can run it, the better. I do think AMD needs to work on a next generation version of FSR upscaling though. There are multiple areas where FSR can be improved, like stability, ghosting, and overall level of detail at lower modes. And if they don't work on their upscaling model, they'll only move further behind Nvidia over time. Luckily, FSR 4 is a very usable upscaler, so these aren't urgent fixes, but I'd like to see AMD continue to work on image quality, especially now they can upgrade their upscaler via the driver. In the meantime, GeForce is king for image quality, and in my opinion, paying a small premium to access DLSS is still worth it. Anyway, that's it for this investigation. I have heard from some people that would like us to look into preset L with DLSS 4.5 as well, so hopefully at some point we'll be getting to that, looking at it compared to preset M and also FSR 4. But for now, yeah, that's basically it. If you want to support us here at Hardware Unboxed, please consider doing so via our Patreon page. Links to those in the description. We have access to some pretty cool benefits like our Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS content, and plenty more. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.